Have you ever encountered a situation where two people fundamentally disagree on the issue but claim themselves to be purely factual? Both of them cite statistics or evidence to back up their claims, but they fail to agree on every single aspect. This phenomenon is way too common in the media or journalism. Think about some of the most polarizing topics in the US, like gun control, abortion, or universal health care. Each side equally claims to be factual and blames the other for being out of touch with reality. We see this phenomenon not because one party is lying, but because both are engaged in the so-called confirmation bias, which is a phenomenon where a person seeks out evidence that confirms their belief and opinion. In this situation, two parties weigh in on different supporting evidence and statistics to reinforce their original claims and disregard those that contradict their beliefs. All of us are biased. We tend to perceive evidence that confirms our pre-existing beliefs as more important than the evidence that disconfirms them. While we can't necessarily avoid being biased, it's critical to understand how confirmation bias comes into our daily lives. Before we go on to explore confirmation bias in the media, let's take a look at 3 types of confirmation bias. The first type of confirmation bias is a biased search for information. This explains how we tend to look for evidence in a one-sided way to support our original hypotheses. For instance, Google searching top 10 reasons to support gun ownership is an example of confirmation bias because, most likely, Google search results give you evidence to support your stance. The second type of confirmation bias is a biased interpretation. This type of confirmation bias explains how we interpret evidence with respect to our existing beliefs by evaluating confirming evidence more favorably than the one that challenges us. For example, Stanford University conducted an experiment where they provided participants with research related to the topic of capital punishment. After reading the same documents, participants held on to their initial beliefs about capital punishment by relying on confirming evidence presented in the studies. The third type of confirmation bias is a biased memory. This type of bias explains how we tend to remember or recall information that confirms our prior beliefs rather than contradictory evidence. If you watch the presidential debate, for example, you might remember the candidate's remarks that confirm your beliefs and stances more than those that contradict them. These 3 types of biases affect the way we perceive information and inform ourselves. Particularly in the media and journalism, confirmation bias directly contributes to the polarization of ideas and political beliefs among media agencies and newspapers. In investigative journalism, confirmation bias can influence which stories editors and journalists decide to be worth reporting. It can influence how they collect evidence and inform the public. Confirmation bias can also influence what data is gathered, which sources are interviewed, and which story is featured. The types of stories CNN covers are vastly different than those that Fox News are covering. Even when covering the same topic, CNN and Fox News often cite different sources and evidence and invite guests with different political backgrounds to provide a narrative that supports their argument. All these reflect the biases of editors and journalists, which in turn amplify the bias of the audience. So how can we reduce confirmation bias when consuming the media? One simple strategy is to first recognize it. Secondly, you can ask yourself if alternative viewpoints are true. For example, when your favorite cable news brings up arguments for universal health care, think of some ways in which others could possibly refute the argument. Instead of asking yourself, why should I support topic A? Ask yourself, why should I not support topic A? Or what are the pros and cons of supporting topic A? Another strategy you can employ yourself is to watch out for repetition. Political tenets often get repeated for emphasis and intensify the effect. This tactic is often employed to make you think something is true because you have heard it so many times. Pay close attention to repetition in the media and be skeptical of what all these public figures tell you again and again. More often than not, spotting confirmation bias in the media is about using your critical thinking skills to assess each piece of information. Now that you've acknowledged your own bias, it's time to look for some of the hidden biases or stereotypes embedded in the media. First, ask yourself, what are the sources? It's important to understand the political spectrums of each media agency before consuming their sources. Some, like Reuters and AP, involve less partisan bias than others, like Vox or Daily Caller. But even when the news outlet is considered less partisan, you should always be wary of the types of sources that it is citing. For example, in the lead-up to the 2003 Iraq War, the New York Times relied heavily on anonymous Bush administration officials to insist that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Another thing you should do is look for unchallenged assumptions or stereotypes in the media. When a gunman in Atlanta attacked 3 Asian-owned spas in 2021, media coverage heavily relied on the law enforcement narrative that Asian spa workers are typically sex workers. It's important to look for unexamined parts of the story's framing within the media coverage and think about how that affects our stereotypes or beliefs. Finally, think of how photographs or visual aids could affect our judgment. Photos or videos could have a much larger impact on our stereotypes and perceptions than we think they do. They can easily skew a storyline or point the audience toward one perspective. For example, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the New York Times article pictured a corpse wrapped in plastic when reporting about COVID-19 in Africa. This deadly visual was misleading, given that Africa overall, at that time, had relatively low infection rates. Confirmation bias in the media is prevalent. As humans, we are all susceptible to it, but that's a part of living in the corporate world. The media engages with the audience in a way that attracts them and makes money. In understanding confirmation bias, we must understand our weaknesses and address them by employing our critical thinking skills to challenge our pre-existing notions. Please visit Biasly's website to learn more about the political leanings of each media source. I hope you enjoy this video on how to spot confirmation bias in the media.